Thanks for the introduction. I'm This is part of a very long paper that I'm going to try and just summarize in like 30 minutes. And it centers around two quotations. And I'm like right at this minute trying to work out which one to start with. But given that this is pandemic perspectives, I'm going to start with this quotation um, from Mary Shelley's The Last Man, written in 1826, about a global pandemic that actually does wipe out what we think is all of humanity, although at the end, the one remaining person uh, with his dog decides to go and look for future humans. But I'm not going to look at the end of the novel. I'm starting by looking at the beginning of the novel, where two unnamed travelers are in Italy in the early 19th century. So the book is written in 1826, but it's talking about the 1810s, where two travelers are walking through on a guided tour of Italy. The tour guide says, "You don't want to go here, it's dangerous." They decide to walk in anyway, and they discover the Sibylline leaves, the cave of the Sibyl. So they see literally leaves on the floor of the cave, and on each leaf is written a fragment of human history, including all of the past. So there's bits in Chinese, there's bits in French, what does it say in the quotation? Ancient Chaldee, Egyptian hieroglyphics, some were in modern dialects, English and Italian. So they pick up one of these leaves in 1815, and one of them narrates the end of the world in 2100. So here's the temporality. Mary Shelley, writing after the eruption of Mount Tambora, which gives Europe the year without a summer. So there's a year without light. There's speculation about the death of the sun. Here's the existential predicament that she poses that I want us to think about. Looks like we have dodged, a pandemic that wipes us all out, right? It's possible, not likely, that the pandemic we're in will have devastating, perhaps system collapsing effects. I don't think global finance is going to collapse. I think there was fear that that might have happened early on. Capitalism stops, collapses. We arrive at something like the end of the social fabric. That doesn't happen for us. It doesn't happen for Mary Shelley, but she contemplates, right? There is a time. So here's the existential predicament. There is a time when we know all humans will end. And that's the condition we're in now, right? We know that all human life will cease to exist. It's whether that concerns us here's the idea I want to take from Mary Shelley and then bring it forward to look at the present. The point at which the end of human existence occurs is definitive of what we take humanity to be. So what do I mean by that? If Mary Shelley, writing in 1826, imagines the end of humanity in 2100, when she imagines it, it's pretty much the same sort of world she's in. So it's still England. It is still England that has had a royal family. The royal family has been deposed. It is now a republic, but the royal family is waiting in the wings, about to come back. So what makes the novel about us, about we humans, is that it imagines that the world would end while we are still recognizable to ourselves, right? So that the world that's ending is still one that we would recognize as our own. And therefore, it's a world that one presumably would care about, right? If the world ends in 2100, it's a cause for some form of existential alarm because it's the end of us. So what she does with this novel is take, at the time, broadly geological and impersonal speculation about the end of species, right? That she's writing in 1826. It's before evolution has become a science, but it is after extinction has been posed as a legitimate scientific hypothesis. So extinction exists before evolution. The extinction of humans exists as a postulation. That's abstract, you know, as Heidegger says, everyone dies someday, right? If, as long as it's everyone dies someday, it's abstract or not enough not to be definitive. But the minute one narrates that end as within one's own world, as recognizable in terms of one's own world, it starts to be about us, and it starts to, here's my argument, define us, right? So what I'm doing in this first stage is either transforming or overturning, depending on how you look at it, Heidegger's relationship between death and individuation. Let's say I never die. Let's just pose that as a logical possibility. If I never die, at some point, I'm going to be Beyonce, Donald Trump, you know, I'll go through all exist. If I really never die, I go through every possibility. However, it's because I die that I am this person and no other, right? I have how many years? 30 years left. And it's that forces me to be who I am. If I have forever, then I'm anyone. I take this to be, that's Heidegger's argument about death individuating. It's this life and no other. If I live forever, I don't really have to bother about making a decision. I could learn French now, but I'll end up learning German, Latin, anything, right? I become all possibilities. What Mary Shelley does, and then I'm going to transition from this quotation towards Deleuze, if one imagines, so the first thing is, if one imagines that one does not die, right, that one would eventually go through all possibilities, that shifts one's comportment towards the world away from individuation, this is me, this is my world, I make these decisions and no others, towards a stoic and probably post-human distance from the world, right? If I am just if what I am living now is just a fragment of eternity, then I have no particular attachment to it. However, if what I am living now is me and this is one world and no other, then I have a particular attachment to it. So first thing I want to do, take that Heideggerian notion of individuation from the individual to the species. So what we are confronting now, what Mary Shelley was confronting in 1826, what we are confronting in 2022 is not that, the human species ends someday, right? What we are confronting is any number of scenarios where we imagine it's 2050, it's 2090, it's 2125. Every IPCC report is giving us a series of dates. Okay, so that's the first thing I want to mark. It's as though we are now in the Sybil's cave, right? We've got all the past, we can see all the past extinctions, but we're getting all these missives from the future, right? The world's going to end in 2050, the world's going to end in 2070, the world's going to end in 2090. Let's say only one of those missives is coming from the IPCC, but there's plenty of others. You know, anyone who doom scrolls, you can read Chris Hedges, Bill McKibben, you know, there's any number of points at which we end. What does it mean to say the species is individuated by those missives that are coming in? First thing is, if one report says the era of driving a car is over, right? Let's just take that one thing, right? By 2050, no one will be able to afford or drive a car, right? If I would imagine for most of America, which is where I'm living right now, that's the end of the world as I know it, right? If that individuates me, that attachment, that notion of humanity, well, then that's the end of the world. If I'm not quite so narrow in my horizons, and if I can imagine, you know, I could live on a subsistence farm, no TV, no internet, no electricity, then the end of the world is probably coming, what, 2200? So my first point is that who we are and what counts as our end is an effect of the objects, the temporal objects and the technological objects to which we're attached. If I can imagine a world without, say, the internet, without electricity, without fossil fuel consumptions, and I think I'm still who I am, then probably the end of the world is coming in like 2300. But if I'm attached to hyperconsumption, a stable climate, the state of ease and personal comfort to which I'm currently enjoying, then the end of the world is probably a lot sooner. And the we for whom that world ends is probably a lot narrower, right? It becomes a smaller world. Okay, so that's my first point. Is we are now at this point, 2022, we are in Mary Shelley's Sibylline Cave. We know that there's an end, and it depends on which letter from the future we read as to whose end that is and when it occurs. If it's the end of affluent Europe, it's probably soon. If it's the end of the human species, it's probably much later. Okay, that's part one-ish. Here's what I want to do. Part of this is to make sense of one paragraph or one sentence from Deleuze's Difference and Repetition. So this is sort of, now I'm entering into Deleuze land. Sorry, not sorry, I guess is what, you know, like I try to give it up and it just, Return of the Repressed, it keeps coming back. So just to put Deleuze's, why I'm doing this, why I think this quotation from Difference and Repetition is important. After Difference and Repetition, Deleuze with Guattari will write Anti-Oedipus, which is a history of the human species, right? Or a history of what comes to recognize itself as the human species. And he refers to it, they refer to it as a negative universal history. By the time we've got to capitalism and individualism, we can realize, so by the time we've arrived at the present we have, we can realize that every prior form of social structure was desperately trying to avoid entering phases of capitalism. The phrase they use throughout Anti-Oedipus is warding off capitalism. Primitive societies, pre-modern societies find all these ways in which capitalism is avoided. So the first thing they do is, instead of seeing history as a progression of increasing technological advancement and civility, it's an increasing failure to ward off state intrusion. What happens is that systems of exchange that prior to capitalism had always been deflected from becoming pure exchange through forms of despotism, extravagant spending, controls on relations, the creation of arbitrary difference, and so on, get leveled out in capitalism. Why is this relevant to the end of the world? Because already in Anti-Oedipus, but I'm going to argue already in Difference and Repetition, Deleuze, and then later Deleuze and Guattari, are posing the question of the attachments that make us who we are. What counts as the world we're in is a consequence of the objects to which we're attached. So in primitive societies, they describe all the ways in which things like rituals, totems, dance, music, series of practices produce differences that preclude a sense of something like a global humanity. They're ways of marking differences from others to preclude a single or general system of exchange. So it's territorialization, for want of a better word, to use their phrase. So territorialization is creative. It produces differences among bodies such that there is no such generic thing called humanity. That's what the beginning of the human is a marking out of difference and strangeness. What other anthropologists see as a progression towards humanity and global recognition is for them a increasing weakening of those creations of differences and a flattening out when capitalism finally produces one system of exchange. When capitalism occurs, it's then possible to see all of history leading up to capitalism, right? Once it occurs, it seems inevitable. But part of the task of both Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus after that, part of the task of that is to say capitalism was not only not inevitable, but most forms of social order try to preclude or ward off that flattening out of differences. Most social systems are creative and productive of difference, which precludes something as general and flat as humanity. So that's their negative universal history. Its aim, or its spirit, if you like, is to see the inevitability of the present as actually not only not inevitable, but that it could also be otherwise, right? We could also exist differently. And part of doing that is to see not only has it not always been this way and it didn't have to be this way, but there are examples of human social structures that successfully resisted state forms and successfully resisted the production of global capital. In that sense, their work is similar to David Graeber's and David Wengrow's New History of Humanity, where the task of anthropology is to show actually what seems human, global recognition, is really an aberration of what most states or most social orders did, which was to resist the coagulation of power or the sedimentation of power in the state. This means that there is something existential and creative about history and destiny. That if one can imagine one's attachment extending beyond capitalism, right? If we can imagine the human not in its current form, if we can imagine the world not in its current form, but if we can imagine the human and the world as including non-state societies, then who we are, right, the attachments we have, and when the world ends becomes a far broader and creative question. So this brings me back to this quotation I have from Difference and Repetition, and the relationship between destiny and freedom. So I'm going to read this out and then try and piece all this together with a new conception of where we go. Oh, wrong slide. Where we go with history and who we are and the future. Okay, so this is from like fairly early on in Difference and Repetition. It's the translation, obviously. Destiny never consists in step-by-step deterministic relations between presents which succeed one another according to the order of a represented time. My gloss on that is destiny is not mechanical causation, right? It's not a form of history in which everything is leading up to the present, or in which capitalism was going to happen one way or the other, whether in China, whether in the West. It just needed the right conditions. So the first implication of this is a refusal of something like mechanical causation, or seeing history as a series of causal blocks. Rather, it implies between successive presents, non-localizable connections, actions at a distance, systems of replay, resonance and echoes, objective chances, signs, signals and roles, which transcend spatial locations and temporal successions. What the hell does that mean? It means that as a historian, one can look back at moments and see that the present one inhabits need not have occurred, right? There were other possible outcomes, and doing that, that is the action at a distance, doing that transforms the present. If we see all of the past inevitably leading up to capitalism, then this is who we are and our world is about to end, right? If we look back and see it did not have to be this way, there were always attempts to ward off or prevent the world in which we're currently living, then who we are becomes something very different. We say, back to the quotation, we say of successive presents which express a destiny that they always play out the same thing, the same story, but at different levels. Here, more or less relaxed, there, more or less contracted. Again, here's human history. We're in Mary Shelley's cave. The Sibylline leaves are all before us. If we just pick up the one that relates to our own present, we have very little freedom. If we're thinking about who we are as, and I mean, I'm obviously not European, but if we think of ourselves as European, then pretty much our range of freedom is limited, right? If we think of who we are as having a far broader temporal range, like humanity would include all these different variations, then our freedom is expanded, right? This is why destiny works so badly with determinism, but so well with freedom. Freedom lies in choosing the levels, right? So the narrower our range of history, the narrower our attachments, the narrower the sense of who we are, right? If we're playing out currently, I think we're in World War III. People say we could enter World War III. I think currently we're in World War III. I think that's another topic. If our focus is that terrain, then we are a very small fragment of humanity and we are probably doomed. But if one imagines the broader one's temporal range, the broader one's attachments, the expansion of one's freedom. To look back at a moment when we might have become otherwise is then an expansion of the future. A succession of presence is only the manifestation of something more profound, namely the manner in which each continues the whole life at a different level or degree to the preceding. Since all levels, so this is where I tie Deleuze to Mary Shelley and a quite specific form of Stoicism. Since all levels and degrees coexist and present themselves for our choice on the basis of a past which was never present. This is Deleuze referring to what in Difference and Repetition he refers to as a pure past. To imagine that everything we live has already been played out, so that one's own future is a selection or a fragment of something that was already there virtually. Why is that abstract, like incredibly abstract philosophical? I think it's an incredibly abstract philosophical idea. Why is that pertinent for the urgency of the present? I think it has direct practical, like therapeutic practical, but political practical as well, implications. That if we are concerned about our existence, it's because of the attachments we have, right? The idea that the world we're living in, the world we call our own, will end in 2050 is utterly tragic because it's our own world, and one's saying the non-existence of one's own being. If one has broader temporal amplitude, then instead of being individuated by Western capitalism and one's own moment in time, the future and who we are has a greater degree of freedom, and it also allows us to think less about saving the world and saving who we are and holding on to the present and freaking out at the thought that the world we have now may no longer exist in 10, 20 years. And instead, looking to what might be possible in the absence of our present attachments. It also has a practical existential force in asking us how we might behave towards the future if we're no longer concerned with saving ourselves, where ourselves amounts to a very narrow range and temporal range and temporal definition of who we are. So just to conclude, this might seem like a little, and I'm going to conclude in like 2 minutes. I'm going to finish by looking at this moment from Byron's Darkness, also from around the same time Mary Shelley wrote The Last Man. So in Darkness, Byron imagines the death of the sun. A poem's about 100 lines. And in that 100 lines, he describes humans eating each other. And in that line, this is nearly 10 lines of the poem, nearly 10% of the poem devoted to a dog. My claim is that Deleuze, Shelley, Byron are cynics in the Stoic sense. And that's what this detachment from one's own time would amount to. So this is from Byron's Darkness. The meagre by the meagre were devoured. Even dogs assailed their masters, all save one, and he was faithful to a course and kept the birds and beasts and famished men at bay till hunger clung them, or the dropping dead lured their lank jaws. Himself sought out no food, but with a piteous and perpetual moan, and a quick desolate cry, licking the hand which answered not, with a caress he died. On the right is a picture of Byron's dog, to which he wrote another poem, but that's another story. Why do I conclude with this? Because Byron imagines the death of the sun. So life is gone, right? It's over. And there's two possibilities. After this, there's humans that look at each other and die of horror because all that's left is humanity. And that's possibility one. Or he poses this existential notion right at the end. There's no future, right? Everyone's eating each other. What do? Do you hold on and keep devouring everything around you? Or in the face of, at this moment, death of the universe, the sun has died, or death of the cosmos, or death of the world, the sun has died, do you merely, like this dog, right? Every other dog is eating their master, just refuse devouring, right? And respectfully, with a caress, that's your last gesture, is to pay respect to the life that is present, as opposed to maintaining one's own life. I see this as what unites these three quotations, and what I want to conclude with is a form of cynicism in which one can abandon one's attachments to the point where one's existence is beyond one's own time. And that allows for a non-devouring and respectful homage to the present. And I'll conclude there.